Welcome to 5 incredible stories of human survival. These individuals have pushed the boundaries far beyond human expectations and lived to tell the tale. Let's begin with the awesome Steve Callaham. In 1982, Steve took part in a transatlantic race which started in England and ended in Antigua. Unfortunately, Steve's boat became mercy to the giant waves and he was out of the race. He fixed up his 20-foot homemade boat and decided to complete the race on his own back. On the 29th of January 1982, Steve set out from the Canary Islands, destination the Caribbean. For the first week, the sea was calm with steady wind, food supplies were good and he was enjoying his solitude surrounded by ocean. After a week of ideal conditions, the weather took a turn. The wind picked up and a storm was brewing. Steve decided to sit it out till morning when suddenly a massive ear-shattering noise ripped through the boat. Steve to this day does not know what it was but believes it must have been a whale. The boat began to fill with water and he was going down. Steve had to evacuate or he would be pulled down into the depths of the ocean. He managed to inflate and board the emergency raft, but all his food supplies were still on the sinking boat. His survival instinct kicked in and he reboarded the sinking boat to retrieve his supplies. All he managed to collect was a cabbage, a box of eggs and a tin of peanuts, barely a day's supply. As morning grew, Steve was lost, alone and had no way of getting help. He wrapped himself in his drenched sleeping bag, causing his sore, salty skin to erupt with boils. His back, knees and bum were also covered with cuts and bruises. He had 8 pints of water that was in his emergency raft and rationed himself to a mouthful every 6 hours. Days passed and water supplies were low. Steve managed to makeshift a solar still that produced a small amount of fresh water, but food was non-existent apart from a few fish he managed to catch. After 2 weeks adrift, he spotted a boat. After firing several flares, he watched the boat disappear into the distance. 40 days in, the raft became a battle in itself. Constant punctures kept Steve exhausted. He had no meat on his body and his cuts were infected and reaching his nerve endings, sending horrific pains all over his body. 76 days in and his body and mind was shutting down, but he had been throwing inedible fish guts overboard and a crowd of birds were following him. Miraculously, a group of fishermen saw the birds from a distance and thinking there must be fish nearby, set out to see what was going on. They found Steve, and after 67 days at sea, he had lost over a third of his body weight and it would take him 6 weeks before he could walk again, but Steve Callaham was finally safe. In the early morning of May 26, 2013, O'Keen had just gotten up and was about to go into the bathroom. Suddenly, his ship was hit by what a spokesman later called a sudden ocean swell. O'Keen could only watch helplessly as his daily life turned upside down. The tugboat capsized and plummeted 100 feet below the surface, with him still inside. Trapped in the dark abyss with no one else in sight and wearing nothing but his boxers, O'Keen waded through the ship's corridors which was slowly filling with icy water. He managed to locate a source of light, some Coca-Cola and a few tools, and he made it to a relatively safe corner of the sunken ship. O'Keen ended up bunking in a 4-foot air pocket under the surface, holding back the water as best he could and stacking mattresses as the cold water rose to keep dry. To make things worse, sharks and barracudas soon started roaming the ship's interiors. He could hear them fighting for the remains of his shipmates in other rooms and swimming in the water just below him. He had no food and the salt water and the bumps from the accident were wearing his skin raw, but miraculously the lethal cold water aided O'Keen by absorbing the deadly carbon dioxide he was breathing out, so CO2 never built up to toxic levels. When a recovery team was sent down, they expected no survivors, and O'Keen gave a diver the shock of a lifetime as the second he heard human sounds, he announced his presence by pounding the wall with a hammer. The divers fled and returned with backup, and after almost 3 days of desperately hoping, praying and reminiscing about family and friends, O'Keen was finally brought to the surface in a decompression chamber by salvage divers. He had no idea, however, how much time had passed, but made a full recovery. In 1985, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates successfully climbed the Suala Grande, a 2,000-foot mountain in the Andes of Peru. Their ascent was a great success. They completed the mountain on time and the weather conditions were looking good, but this story of survival is during the descent. They were both exhausted and decided to rest up for the night and continue the following morning. As morning rose, things were already looking bad. Simon's fingers had turned black from frostbite and their supplies had been used up. They were both roped to each other and began climbing down a sheer section of ice. Suddenly, Joe slipped and was free falling. He smashed into the base of a cliff and his tibia drove itself into his right knee joint. Somehow, Simon managed to drive his ice axe into the mountain to prevent them both from falling. They were now 19,000 feet up and could not see each other at either ends of the rope. Simon and Joe both knew they would not get down together, but Joe knew Simon needed to cut the rope in order to save himself. But he didn't. He began slowly lowering Joe down the mountain. He would descend a small distance and then lower Joe down, refusing to leave him behind. Suddenly, Joe began sliding down the mountain fast. He shouted up to Simon, but his words went unheard. He was now free falling in the air and came to a halt. Joe was now dangling 15 foot below the lip of a cliff with over 100 foot of darkness below him. Simon was now hanging on with the full weight of Joe below him. Simon used his penknife to cut the rope, as he knew they would both die if they stayed there. Joe was now falling into the dark hole. He hit the ground and realised he wasn't dead, but was sliding into an ice glacier. He came to a stop and realised he had no food and no way of letting Simon know he was alive, and had a completely shattered right leg. He knew the only way out was if he slid further into the glacier, hoping to find an exit at the bottom of the mountain. Joe promised himself there and then that he was going to get out alive, and kept crawling down the glacier, when suddenly he seen a light at the bottom. Finally he reached it and was amazingly at the bottom of the mountain. He could see footprints in the snow which he knew were Simon's. He crawled and crawled for hours following Simon's footsteps. Back at base camp, Simon was in his tent when he heard howling outside. He went out to have a look and could see Joe crawling towards him. That feeling must have been absolutely incredible. They both returned home and recovered well, knowing that if Simon hadn't have cut the rope, they both would have died there and then. In 2003, 28-year-old Aron Ralston was cycling through a national park in Utah. He leaves his bike and begins to hike the rest of his journey. Coming to a 65-foot drop, he decides to rappel down, as he has come prepared with all his climbing gear. During the rappel, he reaches a ledge that has a large boulder below it. Just 9 feet from the canyon floor, Aron knows he can reach the boulder and then drop down onto the floor. He lowers himself onto the boulder and carefully grabs hold of it, lowering himself down. Suddenly the boulder shifts and he immediately falls. He raises his right arm in an attempt to protect his head. He comes to a halt. Utter silence fills the canyon and he feels a deep burning in his right arm. The boulder which he was standing on is now pinning his arm against the canyon face. The pain hits him like a lightning bolt, but he knows he needs to act fast whilst he is filled with adrenaline. He tried pulling his arm out with his left arm, but it's stuck. He only has 1 litre of water left and consumes a third of it in one go. Luckily his arm is not bleeding. He uses the file on his penknife to try and chip away at the rock, but to no success. As night falls and the temperature drops, Aron is struggling. 3 days later he is still there, and he knows he will have to amputate his arm in order to survive. He drives his penknife into his forearm but can't cut the bone. He gives up and accepts the fact that he is going to die. He begins to hallucinate. He carves the 30th of April into the rock as he does not expect to last another day. On day 6, Aron said he had an epiphany. He has this idea that if he can get enough tension on the bone, he could snap it in two, and then all he would need to do is cut the remaining flesh. Without any hesitation, he yanks his right arm and hears a crack echo through the canyon. For the next hour, Aron cuts through his skin and tendons using a blunt penknife. He comes to the nerves. He knows this is going to get painful, as just touching it with his penknife causes immense pain. He grits it and cuts through the nerves. He's free. He somehow begins staggering across the desert when he is spotted by a family. A helicopter arrives, and after 127 hours since the accident, Aron is safe. In the summer of 2005, Navy SEAL Marcus Luttrell and his 3 companions, Axe, Mike and Danny, were dropped into the Hindu Kush of central Afghanistan. Their duty was to carry out surveillance on a group of buildings used by the local Taliban commander. During their ascent up a mountain, they stumbled across a small group of Afghan goat herders. Not knowing if they were local civilians or Taliban, they decided to let them go. This was the mistake that changed their lives forever. They were Taliban and quickly reported the SEALs to other Taliban members. A few hours later, the team entered a small area that had high grounds on 3 sides, a perfect location for the Taliban to attack. Moments later, some 100 Taliban fighters were aiming down at the team, armed with machine guns, assault rifles, RPGs and mortars. All havoc began taking place. It was 100 versus 4, and there was a sheer drop behind the team. They had no choice but to take the fall. They all hit the ground hard. One soldier, Danny, was shot twice. He heroically continued to fight but was shot a 3rd time in the throat and then the face. 4 had become 3. Thousands of bullets rained down on them. Mike took a shot in the chest and an axe in the head, but they continued to fight. Mike Murphy knew in order to call for backup he needed to go out into the open and get a signal. He ran out into the open ground and called for backup. He managed to call them, but he was shot dead moments later. Axe was now dying fast, and after their 2-hour firefight, Marcus was on his own. Axe's last words to him were "stay alive," and that's exactly what he would do. An RPG came crashing down on Marcus. He was knocked unconscious and blasted over the edge of a ravine. He awoke upside down with a broken nose, broken shoulder and a broken back. An American Army Chinook helicopter flew overhead. This was Marcus's ticket out of here, but the helicopter was shot down by the Taliban, killing all members on board. Marcus was completely alone with no sign of backup. He could barely even crawl and the Taliban were hunting him. He was so thirsty that his tongue had stuck to the roof of his mouth. A shot rang out. Marcus was hit in the leg by a Taliban sniper. The force knocked him back down the mountain which he had been crawling up the past few hours. 3 Taliban soldiers caught up with him, but he managed to shoot the one and throw a grenade at the other 2. He continued to crawl for hours when all of a sudden he could see 3 Afghan men looking down at him. He was prepared for his final stand, but these were not Taliban. They were local civilians who helped Marcus. Against all the odds, he decided to trust them. He was carried to a village where the local civilians had no time for the Taliban. There was an American base camp 40 miles away, but Marcus knew he couldn't make it there. Amazingly, one of the locals volunteered to make the journey and alerted the American troops of Marcus's whereabouts. Marcus was rescued and returned home a hero. If it wasn't for the kindness of those civilians and the heroic bravery of his team, Marcus would have surely died that day. So that's it for 5 incredible survival stories, and my heart goes out to all those heroes who have proven that anything is possible. Thanks for watching.